This talk, as you know, is number 6, I think, in the series of 10 talks that we're doing as a community, as a group on the Eightfold Path. And the theme of tonight's talk will be wise livelihood, but I wanted to kind of review a little bit where we've been and where we're going. Is there something? It's getting a lot of, what am I doing wrong here? Take it off? Phil thinks my wires are twisted. Should I take that personally? Let's put this down here. We'll put it there. We'll try that. How's that? Yeah, that's better. That's better. My wires were twisted, actually. So the Eightfold Path is kind of a travel guide, really, on the road to freedom from suffering, on the road to liberation. Away from my mouth. Down. Down and to the... How's that? Now you can't... Can you hear me all right? This is actually an experiment. We're going to spend the whole evening trying to figure out how to get this to work. How's that? All right. All right. I'll try not to make any strange noises. So we started out with an overview, and we'll actually end with an overview. By the way, the last of the series, I think it is June 21st, several of us who will have taught will be here, and we'll answer questions. I know some questions have come to me, and if there are questions that arise, you can either email one of us, email me, Sharon@metta.org, or I brought some papers too. You can come up afterwards, grab a sheet of paper and write it down, and we'll collect those and respond to those at the end of the series, and as a way of trying to summarize. So the first talk was on wise view and really understanding what this path is about and what the fundamental teachings are. Understanding that dukkha, suffering, stress, is a fact of life. That there is impermanence. That we really, as much as we try to kind of hang on and have this self that is like secure and ultimately okay, that because of impermanence, because of the fact that everything is conditioned by everything else, we're just not in charge. And so this, to kind of understand that as a general framework, is a really crucial piece of our path. And then wise intention, really understanding that and practicing the quality of letting go of trying to hang on, letting go of trying to make things work out on our own terms, cultivating an awareness of what is, the Buddha tells us, is actually already deeply present within us, this quality of kindness and compassion that flourishes actually when we get out of our own way. So wise intention. Wise speech. The Buddha invites us to speak what is true, correct, and beneficial. Only what is true, correct, and beneficial. And he says if it's welcome and agreeable, great. If it is unwelcome and disagreeable, one might still say that, but you really need to know when and where and how to do that. So wise speech. Hugh Byrne talked about wise action. Really, he spoke about the kinds of habits that we have that are automatic habits. And, so wise action, sort of the three middle ones. The first two have to do with wisdom, wise view and wise intention. The three middle ones, wise speech, wise action, and now wise livelihood, have to do with how we behave. And then the last three will be wise effort, wise mindfulness, and wise concentration. both the fruits of our practice and the way to accomplish the end of our practice. So this whole period is really inquiring into the travel guide. At the very beginning I said, I brought my little travel books. It's sort of like, when you're traveling on a journey, you say, okay, where do I stay and what do I do and how do I navigate? And this is the Buddha's travel guide on the way to liberation. Each one is kind of a hologram, really. Each one, if we really understand how to practice each one, we understand all the rest. So to really kind of get this, we're offering this overview, this sense of, okay, this is the travel guide that the Buddha offers on the path to enlightenment. This is from Ajahn Lee Damadero. He says, our ultimate aim should be to make the mind still until we reach the natural reality that exists on its own within us, that knows on its own and lets go on its own. This is the practice of the Dhamma that will lead us to the realization of the Dhamma, the true taste and nourishment of the Dhamma. And then another quote, whether you are to win or lose, let go or cling, will depend on how much quality you've built into your own mind. This is why we are taught not to cling to the scriptures and texts, to meanings and concepts. Only when we actually train ourselves to get beyond all this will we be heading toward liberation. So there's sort of this guide for how to practice, how to live, how to understand, and which will take us to the natural liberation of our own being. So tonight I wanted to talk a little bit about wise livelihood, in terms of what we do with our lives. And on the surface it can seem sort of mundane, in terms of wise livelihood seems like sort of a no-brainer in a way. But if we try to meditate our way to liberation without really practicing some of these what are called sila or virtue qualities, it won't work. Many of you, I've sometimes used Tony Soprano, if you remember that series, as an example. And Tony Soprano was murdering and stealing and lying routinely, and was seeing a therapist trying to be happy. It's like, wait a minute, And so the Buddha is saying that it won't work. Forget it, save your money, it won't work. Save your time. It won't work if we're not living in a way that is upright, or one of the translations of sila is morality. I'll offer a couple more as we go through tonight. I wanted to tell you a story as we begin. There's a Zen story where some of you have been on retreats, so you know how the interviews go. And in Zen, the interview is you go in and you have a very specific question. I think Susan knows more about this than I do. But you have a very specific question, and then in some cases with some of the teachers, the teacher will give an answer, sometimes a sort of like paradoxical answer, and then just ring the bell and say, okay, we're done. So there's no elaborate discussion. In Vipassana we do all kinds of groovy, elaborate discussions. But in Zen there aren't so many elaborate discussions. So there's a story about a student who went into his teacher on one of the retreats, and he said, how is my practice going? You've known me for a long time. Tell me what you think, how you think my practice is going. And so the teacher said, open your mouth. Let me look in your mouth. And then let me see your ear. How's your ear doing? And then, bend your head down and let me see the top of your head. And he said, I think your practice is going just fine. And then he rang the bell, and the student left. And then the student came in the next time, the next day, and said, that was a little confusing. I didn't understand. I still want to know how my practice is going. And the teacher said, well, actually, it's terrible. You're really a wretched student. You don't understand anything at all about the practice. And that was the end of that. So then the student left. And then the next day he came in and he said, now wait a minute. Look at all I've been doing. Look at how much I've grown. Look at what I'm doing for the community. That's just not fair. That's not an accurate assessment. I just don't think that's right at all. And the teacher said, oh, you have a point. Okay, yes, your practice is fine. And the next day, the student came in and said, okay, my practice is what it is. And the teacher said, how you have responded to these interviews is an index of your practice. How you respond in terms of when things go your way, when they don't go your way, how you live your life is an index of your practice. I thought it was a nice story. Because it's really true, and it's really what Sila is about. Sila is about both living our lives in such a way that our practice will work, if you will, and letting the working of our practice on the cushion really deeply affect how we live our lives, which in turn affects how our practice works, which in turn, so it's like they're really related to one another. So it's not about, a bunch of rules. It's sort of like the Boy Scouts or the Girl Scouts or something, about how you are supposed to behave, so much as if you want this recipe to work, if you want this travel guide to get you where you want to go, these are important components, these sila, these morality components, wise speech, wise action, and now wise livelihood. Next week, I think it is, there'll be a talk on wise effort, and I'll give you a little preview because wise effort, as you know, has 4 qualities. To prevent the arising of unwholesome states that deter your calm and clarity. So to prevent the arising, to abandon unwholesome states that are already arisen. So the first 2 have to do with unwholesome states. And then the second two have to do with to arouse unarisen, as yet unarisen, wholesome states. And to maintain wholesome states that have already arisen. I like to think of it as do what works and don't do what doesn't. Do what helps and don't do what doesn't. In terms of cultivating, maintaining peace and calm and clarity in your own mind and in the manifestations in your life. So at its most broad level, wise livelihood, or sila, means non-harming. Living in a way that doesn't harm. The Buddha was very explicit. Now he was living in a very different culture, but these still apply. He was very explicit in the suttas. There are some things that he says you should not do in terms of how you spend your life. Wealth should be gained in accordance with, this is from the suttas, wealth should be gained in accordance with certain standards. One should acquire it only by legal means, not illegally. One should acquire it peacefully, without coercion or violence. One should acquire it honestly, not by trickery or deceit. And one should acquire it in ways which do not entail harm and suffering for others. And the Buddha actually mentions 5 specific kinds of livelihood which bring harm to others. See how you're doing on these. And are therefore to be avoided. Dealing in weapons, in living beings, and here he includes raising animals for slaughter, as well as slave trade and prostitution. How are we doing on the slave trade part? In meat production and butchery, in poisons, and dealing in intoxicants. So those are some livelihoods that the Buddha says really are not wholesome for us if our agenda is liberation. He further names several dishonest means of gaining wealth which fall under wrong livelihood, practicing deceit, treachery, soothsaying, trickery, and usury. Obviously, any occupation that requires violation of right speech and right action is a wrong form of livelihood. But other occupations, such as selling weapons or intoxicants, may not violate those factors and yet be wrong because of their consequences for others. So let's assume that none of us are engaged in dealing weapons or, waging war or prostitution or some of the others, slave trade, poisons, making of poisons. So what then does non-harming mean? One of the things that I started to think about as I was thinking about this talk is how we might indirectly be contributing to some of those kinds of livelihoods. And to kind of subtle levels of violence or unwise speech. And I looked it up because I remembered this quote from March. And this is from Fortune magazine. I'll read it to you. And it's a quote from the chairman of CBS News about, they were asking him whether or not the news had created the Republican kind of chaos, and in particular Donald Trump. If they, it's kind of the negative sides of that, the violence in some of the rallies. So it's a more subtle level of violence, but they were asking, his name is Leslie Moonves or something, and he's the chairman of CBS. And here's the article, or a quote from the article from Fortune magazine. It says, it's still up for debate whether or not the media, quote, created, close quotes, Donald Trump, or at least the GOP presidential frontrunner version of him. But there is no doubt the billionaire reality TV star turned politician has meant big ratings and income for networks. Leslie Moonves, the chairman of CBS, admitted as much on Monday. Quote, it may not be good for America, but it's damn good for CBS, he said at a Morgan Stanley conference in San Francisco. He referred to the presidential election cycle as a, quote, circus, close quotes, went on to note his surprise at the turn of events that have propelled Trump from a laughingstock to the Republican leader in terms of presidential delegates heading into Super Tuesday. The money's rolling in, and this is fun, they quoted him as saying. I'd never seen anything like this, and this is going to be a very good year for us. Sorry, it's a terrible thing to say, but bring it on, Donald. Keep going. This is not a comment about Donald Trump. This is a comment about the kind of rancor that the news was feeding, and he was saying, bring it on, this is really great for ratings. It's a terrible thing to say, but this is really great for ratings. So I remember being struck by that at the time when I heard that. And since then, I've been sort of contemplating that, wondering if my reading these articles in the Washington Post is wise livelihood. That the articles come up and I think, do I really need this for my well-being today? And it's really an interesting dilemma at times, because it's sort of like, well, I don't really want to dig into the work that I have to do today, so maybe I'll read another article. And I'm actually feeding the very same thing. So we can kind of be a little self-righteous about his position, but, is wise livelihood for me, is the things that I read in the Washington Post, because I read it online, and you better believe they're tracking me in terms of the number of hits that an article gets. And so is that, wow, so it really kind of comes all the way down to a very simple choice that I make about, am I contributing to violence by supporting this kind of journalism that contributes to violence? So it really, so even though I'm not, dealing in weapons to ISIS, if we really kind of look closely, we can kind of look and see, are we doing things that are leading to harming? So an interesting kind of question. This is from Bhikkhu Bodhi. He says, what is really being cultivated through the observance of moral precepts is the mind. So what am I cultivating when I'm reading some of these articles? Thus, while the training in Sila brings the public benefit of inhibiting socially detrimental actions, it entails the personal benefit of mental purification, preventing the defilements of greed, hatred, and delusion from dictating to us what lines of conduct we should follow. So an interesting kind of inquiry for us in terms of, how we spend our days and spend our time. And then this, you've heard me read this before from Thomas Merton. He says, there is a pervasive form of contemporary violence, and that is activism and overwork. The rush and pressure of modern life are a form, perhaps the most common form, of its innate violence. To allow oneself to be carried away by a multitude of conflicting concerns, to surrender to too many demands, to commit oneself to too many projects, to want to help everyone or everything, is to succumb to the violence of our times. The frenzy of our activism neutralizes our work for peace. It destroys our own inner capacity for peace. It destroys the fruitfulness of our own work because it kills the root of inner wisdom, which makes work fruitful. So another way of really looking at the extent to which our livelihood may or may not be harmful for ourselves and others. In the Metta Sutta, there is a line that says the Buddha invites us to be unburdened with duties. Unburdened with duties and frugal in our ways. That's what the Metta Sutta invites. So the challenge for us, even in wise livelihood, we can kind of not understand some of the subtlety of it, is to really pay attention to what the mind is doing and what's feeding how we live. What's feeding how we live our lives? How are we feeding our minds? So to release the defilements is to not be driven by greed, hatred, or delusion, to not be consumed by trying to make permanent things that are not permanent, and to not try to control what is not under my control. Wise livelihood. Or trying to take personally the dukkha of life, the suffering of life, that is not really personal. This is an old cartoon, an Opus cartoon. I'll read it to you. There's this guy who comes racing in, his tie is flying, and he says, and Opus is sitting at his little desk that says, "Fast philosophy to go." Oh, it says, "We wear Birkenstocks" underneath there. And the guy comes racing in and he says, "Whoa, yo, I'm next." He says, "Okay, I'm 40, twice divorced, closing in on VP of sales, expanding my bond portfolio, questioning my morality and purpose, and due at a teleconference in 2 minutes." And his glasses are flying off. He says, "I need some perspective, but I'm too busy to think about it. So give me something." He throws his money at him. "Give me something, quick, quick, quick." And then Opus says, "Wherever you go, there you are." And then the little bird over here is in the corner is saying, do happens. So that's his philosophy. He says, that's it? That's all? If I can get some great onion rings in 30 seconds, why can't I also get some blankety blank truth? And then in the next frame, he says, he's having a heart attack. He says, and so he falls on the ground, and then Opus says, do happens. And then he says, that's another buck. All right. But we do this with our livelihoods, don't we? No. And again, we can kind of laugh at, some corporate executive out there. But in Thomas Merton's quote about just how we spend our lives and how guilty we feel, we do or do not feel, if we're just sitting and, relaxing, just kind of bringing ourselves into calm and a bit of ease. So the second, the third translation of sila that I'd invite you to think about is the translation of harmony. So that one of the words that is used to translate sila is the word harmony. So some of these moral precepts as cultivating harmony internally, harmony externally, interpersonally, harmony in the mind, harmony in terms of cause and effect, harmony within ourselves, harmony with others. So not just abstinence, not just refraining from doing something that is actively harmful, but the cultivation of the mind and of speech and behavior that leads to harmony in our livelihood. The absence of greed, aversion, or delusion. Harmony of the body, where we cultivate a calm nervous system and good health. Harmony of the mind, where we're free from guilt and remorse. We're happy. Harmony of relationships with myself and with other people. And harmony in the world. So livelihoods that cultivate harmony. What I'd like to invite you to do is the Buddha, in one of my favorite suttas, is the sutta where he talks to Mahanama and he tells him what we should be thinking about, what we contemplate. And one of the things that he invites us to contemplate is our own virtues. So what I'd like to invite you to do is either, if you want to do it just by yourself, that's fine, but maybe you might want to turn to somebody near you and contemplate harmony and how you cultivate harmony in your work life, in your livelihood. So rather than contemplating how you don't cultivate harmony, contemplate how you do. Contemplate the goodness that you bring to your livelihood in small ways or large. I'm just inviting you to inspire each other a little bit. So take a few minutes, and I know some of you usually prefer to just not do this in dialogue, so that's fine too. But if you contemplate with a partner, you may well be inspired a bit. So contemplate, how do you cultivate harmony in your livelihood, in your work life? So take a few minutes there. Either. In case you didn't already, make sure you know your partner's names. Anything that anyone wants to observe or share? Yeah. How do you already practice wise livelihood? By an intention to cultivate harmony. Anybody want to share anything? It's hard to share our goodness. Pardon? Practicing excellent customer service. Nice. So serving. What's interesting? What do you find interesting?
Nobody's talking.
What?
That nobody's talking.
What's interesting about that?
Well, it makes me wonder why.
Huh.
And it makes me wonder why I am not open to sharing what I so easily shared with Charlotte just a few moments ago.
One time, I teach Insight Dialogue, and when I was first practicing Insight Dialogue, my teacher, Gregory Kramer, had us practice with a partner contemplating our virtues. And it was remarkably difficult with just one other person. Now, if I had said, contemplate the ways that you don't, it might be easier, huh? Yeah. Anybody? Anything else? Yeah.
I had an insight after you called us back.
Uh-huh. Little louder if you can.
I was thinking a lot of thoughts I had about harmony were big things,
Yeah.
big things. But then I realized that's really not where it's at. Where it's really at is in the little things.
Yeah.
In the little, like whether you screw the top on the toothpaste, that whole thing.
Uh-huh.
The little things, that's really.
Yeah. Did you all hear that? That it's, we think of it as big things, but it's really the little things, like whether you screw the top back on the toothpaste. Yeah. Yeah. Or sort of a bowing to someone else, to their needs and wishes. Yeah. At least in my family. Yeah. Anybody else? I'll read you a quote. Both of them are from Sufis. This is from a Sufi mystic, Irina Tweedy. She wrote, "The realization that every act, every word, every thought of ours not only influences our environment, but for some mysterious reason forms an integral and important part of the universe, fits into it as if by necessity, so to say, in the very moment we do or say or think it, is an overwhelming and even shattering experience." So every act, every word, every thought of ours influences our environment. In the very moment we do or say or think it, is what she's saying, and what her realization was. The tremendous responsibility of it is terrifying. If all of us only knew that the smallest act of ours, or a tiny thought, like, putting the cap back on the toothpaste, has such far-reaching effects as to set in motion forces which perhaps could shatter a galaxy. If we know it deeply and absolutely, if this realization becomes engraved permanently on our hearts, on our minds, how careful we would act and speak and think, how precious life would become in its integral oneness. And this, I think, is as far as the human mind and heart can go. That's one. And I'll end with a poem by Hafiz. The title is Now is the Time. Now is the time to know that all you do is sacred. Now, why not consider a lasting truth with yourself and God? Now is the time to understand that all your ideas of right and wrong were just a child's training wheels to be laid aside when you finally live with veracity and love. Hafiz is a divine envoy whom the Beloved has written a holy message upon. My dear, please tell me, why do you still throw sticks at your heart and God? What is it in that sweet voice inside that incites you to fear? Now is the time for the world to know that every thought and action is sacred. Now is the time for you to compute the impossibility that there is anything but grace. Now is the season to know that everything you do is sacred. I particularly love the part where he says of himself, he says, Hafiz is a divine envoy whom the Beloved has written a holy message upon. And I guess that applies to us, huh? To you. You know, when you do customer service, you know, you're a divine envoy. So our wise livelihood is more than not dealing in arms, you know, but really living with wisdom and care and grace. Now is the season to know that everything you do is sacred. So, we will stop there for tonight. Blessings. Thank you.